Hey, this is Greg, creator of the Leptos web framework for Rust. We have a 0.1.0 beta release coming out today, which I'm very excited about. It's been a lot of work putting together this 0.1 update from the 0.0 series that we had been in. And there are some big developer experience improvements and nice little usability changes. I don't want to walk through some of those in a video today, but I also want to talk about some kind of bigger picture philosophical stuff about how to build web applications with a framework like this, because there are similarities to other frameworks, but there are also some different things. So I thought I would talk about a little bit of my philosophy just so you understand some of the decisions behind the API designs and other things, and so that you can understand how to build the best applications you can using this framework. So we're going to show off some of the 0.1.0 stuff through walking through an example of how to build a really simple dark mode toggle button the best way possible. This is the kind of thing that you'll probably do in all sorts of applications. User wants to set something to dark mode or set it back to light mode. And there are a couple different ways that you can do this. It's a deceptively simple problem, and a lot of the simplest solutions actually cause some really ugly side effects, like a flash of light content before the dark content comes in, stuff like that. So I thought we would kind of walk through how to do this in the best way possible, going through some of the less good options. And I'll throw all the code into a repository in GitHub. I'll just put a link in the video description so you can either follow along or just look back at it later. But yeah, so let's just dive in. First off, I just want to show you, this is going to be using the cargo-leptos build tool and this leptos starter, which you can find right here at github.com, leptos-rs/start. This has all the instructions for how to install cargo-leptos, start a new project using this. And it pulls up just a really simple application template here. So if I show you, it's just these couple of files in a directory. Main.rs, which holds about 50 lines of boilerplate for your server. Lib.rs, which is about 20 lines of boilerplate for the hydration code. And then your application. And pretty much everything that you write can live in this file, or then branching in modules off of it just in normal Rust style. cargo-leptos is a build tool that's designed to coordinate rebuilding the server side of your application and the client side of your application, and then live reloading for nice quick updates. It's been created by Henrik, a member of our community. He's done fantastic work. This is the best and the simplest way to build these kind of center stack integrated server client applications using Leptos. If you want to do just pure client-side rendering in the browser, Trunk is still a really great option. And if you look in the examples in our repository, you'll actually see they all either recommend in their readmes that you use Trunk or that you use cargo-leptos now, depending on whether they are just client-side, browser only, or whether they have the kind of server integration. But it's a great tool, right? So just some basic quality of life stuff like it has Sass built in if you like Sass, or you can just use CSS. But if I'm in this little live reloading version here, you'll see if I just change something in the CSS, you get this instant update. Obviously, you don't need to recompile anything in the WebAssembly there, but it's great just for that kind of dev experience. And then this is just a simple counter type button. But you'll notice, right, if I change the CSS, the state here is maintained, so it doesn't require a page reload at all. It automatically unloads and reloads that style sheet, which is great. It's not quite hot module reloading, but it's at least hot CSS reloading, right? All right, so for now, though, I'm just going to actually close this sidebar. We're going to do most of our work in this app.rs file, and I'm basically just going to start building this thing, and I'll point out some of the advantages of this 0.1.0 along the way. So the first thing you'll notice right here, if you're used to the kind of 0.0 Leptos, is that instead of returning element, we return this impl into view. This is a kind of generic type that anything that comes out of your view macro, anything that you might want to represent as the user interface for your application, implements into view as this trait. And every component can just return this now. Actually, every component should return this. That's one of the small breaking changes in this new release. But so let's say we want to toggle dark mode. One of the typical ways people do this is by doing something like having a dark class on the body and adding or removing that, right? Because then it toggles dark mode for all of the everything in your application. But there's actually an even better way. I learned about this pretty recently. There's a great meta tag called color scheme. And so we can actually use this meta name equals color scheme to toggle whether we're in light mode or dark mode and use the browser settings for that. And the way we can inject a meta tag here, right, is by using the leptos meta package, which we have imported right away in this starter. And we can literally just throw into this app component meta name equals color scheme. And just as a sanity check, let's just give it dark here. You'll see cargo-leptos down here, right, is rebuilding. And of course, this cannot make the Rust compiler faster. It does parallelize the server and the client rebuilds, so it's pretty quick. Okay, and you'll see, right, so a couple seconds, I've got this reloaded page, and it's in dark mode now, right, because I've set this. You'll notice I cannot just throw a meta tag into the body of my application usually as a normal HTML element, right? These go in properly formed HTML. These go in the head, not in the body. But of course, if you're writing an application using a framework like Leptos, and this is one of these philosophical things, you want to build it out of components that are basically self-contained so that you can write the component. It's like a black box. It has all its functionality. You can stash it in some module somewhere, and you don't have to touch it. And that component can be written in a kind of declarative way, right? So you set up your signals, you set up your reactive system, you write your view, and then it just runs. So we don't want to be going in and like manually injecting elements into the head and removing them and whatever. So the Leptos meta package provides some of these metadata type tags, like a title component, a style sheet component that manages like a link rel equals style sheet, right? And a meta component. And it does this both on server-side rendering and on the client-side rendering, right? So if you use it with this sort of, again, center stack application, by which I just mean an application that you're running on both the server and the client and that can kind of bridge that divide, this gets injected as HTML into the head of your document on the server-side render, and then it gets hydrated and picked up on the client side. You'll notice this is one of these little 0.1.0 improvements, right? When I just hovered over this meta, we have much better Rust analyzer support in the view macro now than we used to. So you can see the full docs right here. It's giving an example. Oops. And if I scroll down, it actually gives me required properties, optional properties with types, with docs for those properties. And likewise, if I hover over one of the properties, it gives me the docs for that property as well. And these ones actually link over to MDN, you'll see. So it gives you docs for the actual HTML elements. Okay, so let's actually just create a dark mode component, though. I was talking about declarative component-based UI, right? So let's actually create a component to manage this stuff instead. So of course, I'm going to do that with the component macro here. Let's call it dark mode toggle. And this is just going to take a scope, and it returns, again, that impl into view like all components should. Now we can do things, right? We can actually use the macro here to document this component. So let's say we wanted to give it, I think I'll remove this, but let's say we want to give it an initial value. And that'll be, let's call it prefers dark, right? And that's a bool. Whether the component should initially prefer dark mode. All right, so let's say I want to get rid of this, and I'm going to insert this. Let's say I'm going to put the dark mode toggle right at the top of the main because it will have a button eventually. Dark mode, and you see I've got autocomplete here. Prefers dark, yep, autocomplete on the component property equals true. And then when I close it, you see it's got everything loaded up here. So now we've got, look at this. So it's automatically generated some docs just based on this one doc comment on this function parameter. It's generated some documentation for the component, which includes a required prop, preferred dark, whether the component should prefer dark mode. And if I actually want to make this optional, I can make this optional, right? Because it implements default, so it will just default to false, which is the default value for a Boolean in Rust. Oh, now it's an optional prop, right? So this is super powerful, right? Again, it lets you write your components in a way that's like, I create it, it's modular. I've got this great support here telling me exactly what I need to do. I don't need to go back into my code to look at this. I've just got documentation for it right here. All right, but I'm actually going to take this away because we don't really want that. And so let's go in here and let's create the button, right? And so let's say button on click equals, I don't know, toggle dark mode, right? Let's call it toggle dark mode, and let's close the button. And what should toggle dark mode do? Let toggle dark mode equals, we know it's going to be a closure that does something. Okay, so we probably want to create a signal that's like whether we're currently in dark mode, right? All right, let is dark, set is dark. Let's call it prefers dark again. Set prefers dark, create a signal, and let's just start it with false for now. And then we'll do set prefers dark dot update dark equals what? Not dark. Okay, cool. Yep. So look, it's inferred the type here. This is a mouse event because it's click, and we've got everything's simpatico, right? All right. Very good. So now let's move this meta tag that we had. Oh, I deleted it already. Fine. Right down here. Meta name equals, what was that? Color scheme. Content equals, what should this be? So this is going to be reactive. So we're going to make a little closure here. Make this so I can actually read it. And you know what? Actually, let's pull this out into its own variable just to make it a little easier. And let's say let color scheme equals, so it's going to be a function because it needs to be reactive, right? So anytime you want a reactive value, it needs to be a function because this is the function that Leptos will rerun excuse me, when that value needs to change. All right, so we're going to create a little closure here. And let's see, so this, the value should be light if it's going to be light mode, dark if it's going to be dark mode. So we just say if prefers dark, and remember signals implement the function type. If I'm on nightly rust, if I'm on stable rust, this should just be .get, right? So if it prefers dark.get, then it will just be dark, else light. Cool, and then content color scheme. So does this work? This may actually just have to be a string. What's the error it's giving me? I need to make this bigger. Method prefers dark not found for the struct. Oh, haha, right? Great. So I've just given an invalid component property here since I deleted that prefers dark. That's great. So it's correcting me on the component props. And what's our issue now? Great. Expected string found at string. Great. So we'll just need to make these strings. Okay. So should we try? Let's see. Hey, okay. Look at that, right? So we've got this nice little dark mode button. Awesome. So like that's fine, right? I'm going to change this red text. I just can't stand it. And zoop, there we go. Okay. So we've got this dark mode button, right? And that's kind of fine, right? If you want to do this, that was, you know, a nice little component, 15, 20 lines of code because I formatted it pretty nicely, right? But here's the problem. Now I reload the page and it has no idea that I set that, right? Which is not great. So let's add some way of storing this preference so that the next time I go to the page or if I reload the page or whatever, it'll remember. This is going to be a little messy because I actually forget some of the local storage APIs and I forgot to look it up before I started recording. But let's say function get stored pref. And this is going to return option bool, I think. And so let's see, we want like storage equals window dot local storage. And the reason I'm doing this in a separate function is so that I can use the question mark operator here. Okay. Dot flatten. Cool. This is when I use Rust Analyzer to tell me how to do things. All right. So we've got this storage. Let value equals storage dot get item dark dot okay dot flatten. Cool. And then we're just going to turn value equals true. So we're going to store, in other words, this. Right. So we're going to return if there's this dark item that equals true, and then set stored pref. I think that probably can just return unit. Let storage equals. We're going to do option. This should probably be with the result type, but whatever. And set stored pref, so prefers dark. Let value equals if prefers dark. True. Okay, this is actually stupid. This should just be stringifying the Boolean, right? So we're actually just going to say storage.set item. Key is going to be dark. Value is going to be prefers dark. Dot to string. And this probably takes, a reference here. Okay. Excuse me, I'm getting over a little bit of a cold, and when I'm talking a lot, I'm going to start coughing. All right, so no, we can set the stored preference, get the stored preference. So how do we want to do these, right? Oh, by the way, the other thing I want to point out with this view macro, right, is you'll notice I have view, and then I just have a meta tag, and then smashed on top of a button tag. You don't need a fragment or anything. You don't need a single root element. You can just kind of throw this stuff together, and it works just fine. Okay, so now I want to set the local storage value dark, depending on whether I want to be in dark mode or not. This is the classic use case for create effect, right? So an effect is anytime you want to synchronize something inside the reactive system with the world outside the reactive system. So the whole renderer is built on effects, right? Because the DOM is outside the reactive system. It's hidden from you that these are using effects by the way that the view macro works, but it's creating these little effects to do these updates. But if I want to synchronize with something like local storage, right, that isn't part of a view macro or something, I do just want to create an effect, and I'm going to say create effect. And I'm going to move this in. If you're ever wondering, create effect takes a closure that takes one argument. The argument is actually the previous value of the effect. So if it returns something, it's almost like it takes in the value that it returned the last time. So of course it's an option because the first run it'll be none, and then it's always some return value. So this is really useful if you have some value you want to keep alive and keep ownership of, rather than storing it in a variable outside. You could pass it, you could return it out of the effect and then take it in from the effect the next time. Just a little tip. We don't need to do that right now. So we're just going to say create effect, and we're going to say set stored pref. And this is going to be prefers dark dot get, right? And that should basically, every time prefers dark changes, it should write it into local storage. So just to make sure that's actually working, let's see if I can remember how to do this. I'm much better at Firefox dev tools, and sometimes I forget how to do stuff over in Chrome. This would be applications local storage, right? Let's delete everything from these other applications I have in here. It's not worth it, actually. Yeah, okay, great. So you see dark is being reset every time right here. Great. So that's cool. So then when we reload, it still does nothing. And of course, the reason it does nothing is obvious. It's that we are starting with the initial value here is false, and we actually want to start with the initial value of get stored pref dot unwrap or default. So if we don't have a stored preference, it'll be false, and if we do have a stored preference, it'll be the stored preference. So let's try this again. Toggle dark mode. Oh, it has not actually reloaded the server. Okay, and so now it's panicking, right? Do you know why it's panicking? It's panicking because it's trying to render on the server, and the first thing it does on the server is try to access local storage, which does not exist on the server. Actually, it tries to access the window, which doesn't exist on the server. So we're just going to put a little short circuit here. If config, let's see, feature equals SSR, if I remember how this macro works. So if we're in SSR mode, in other words, if we're server-side rendering, we're just going to return none for now. And if we are in client-side rendering mode, we'll go to the browser local storage. We'll load this. We good? Okay. So you'll see, cool. So if I toggle it off, we're good. If I toggle it on, we're good. If I reload. Now, I want to show you something. You may have seen a little flash. If I force reload this, yeah. Do you see that? So on the server, what I've said, right, is there's no stored preference, which means on the server pass, it's going to say, yeah, prefers dark, defaults to false, which means when it renders this HTML, it is actually going to send me HTML with, let's see, where's my meta tag here? HTML with meta name equals color scheme, content equals light. And then as soon as WebAssembly loads, it's going to look in the local storage and it's going to see that it prefers dark, and it's going to set that color scheme to dark. And if I'm just reloading and this WebAssembly is cached, it's fine. You get a little flash sometimes. But if I do like a forced reload, or if this is the first time I'm on the page, you can actually see there's about 1/4 of a second right there, partly because we're in debug mode, right? So the WebAssembly file is really big, but you can actually see that flash of light mode. That is not great. What we want, and if we were navigating between pages on the site, it may be flashing back and forth, not at all what you want, right? So what you want is actually for it to be correct the first time. So we're going to do my sort of final version of this, right? Where rather than storing it in local storage, we're going to store it in a kind of local, a kind of storage that can be accessed by both the server and the client. And we're going to go kind of old school and just put it in a cookie. This is actually a kind of great way to do stuff like this because you can access cookies from JavaScript, from WebAssembly, but you can also access them from the server, which means if you need to store a value that you need to have during server rendering, but you also want access to, and it's not like a secure thing, you can just put it in a cookie like that. So for this, I am actually going to pull up the version I had written before, just so I don't screw it up a couple of times while I'm trying to write this. But basically, we're going to do this using what's called a server function. So the way that a server function works is we can define a function and mark it with this server macro. And so instead of, you'll notice set stored pref and get stored pref are just normal client-side functions. They don't do anything on the server. They're running just in WebAssembly on the browser, unless we screw it up and we cause the server to panic. But I'm going to create this server function. A server function you can call from the client or the server, but only runs on the server. So what that means is if you call this from the client, it will send a request over to the server, which will run this code on the server. But what's inside this, like the body of this function, only ever runs on the server. So you see, I'll make this a little bigger. We'll walk through it. It has this server, server macro. It names it with this toggle dark mode struct. This will it's just something we have to do so that we can use it as a type, like to register it somewhere. And it's going to take that same prefers dark, and then it returns a result of a bool and server function error. And you'll kind of see how we use this. And then I pull in some stuff from Actix Web itself. and from leptos actix. This example is using the actix web server. We have a very similar integration for Axum that supports all the same things, and we can build ones for other servers if you want. And what we're going to do is actually use the context system that leptos provides to pull in information about the HTTP request. Because remember, the body of this thing only runs on the server. So we have actual access to things like the HTTP request, the headers, everything that's included in there. And this is stuff we don't have access to on the client because it's the one sending the request, but we do on the server. So we're just going to get the response. We're going to use context, pull in this leptos actix response options. And what this does, right, is this is actually going to let us write stuff into the response that we're returning from this server function, in addition to accessing the request. So we haven't set the response yet, but we can do things like set headers, set a response, a status code during the server function that will then be returned on the server. And so this is just, getting that response options, creating this response parts, which is going to take the header and the status code, creating a header map, which is just an actix type, inserting a header into it. So we're going to insert a set cookie header, and then I'm just creating this really simple dark mode equals prefers dark or not, path equals /, which means we can access it just from anywhere on this domain. And then we write that into the response parts, and then do this response.overwrite with response parts. So basically, leptos has already created kind of a response that it would return to this server function, and we're now overwriting those headers with this set cookie header. So this means anytime that we call this toggle dark mode function, it will actually run this code on the server, set this response, and return it, which means that we then have access to this cookie, which is storing this prefers dark value, and that this persists across requests to the server, right? Which is what's really important. Unlike the local storage, which can only be read on the client, this cookie can be read on the client or the server. So then in this initial, right, rather than get stored pref, which was our local storage version, and let's actually just pull out this this local storage code so it's not confusing, and we'll pull out the effect that runs it. We're gonna have a kind of like initial value, right? So let's see what kind of a function should initial value be. It should probably take scope, and it should probably return option bool, just like the other one. Now this is gonna be a little different on the client and on the server. If we're on the client, we want to access document, and we want to access the cookie field on the document. And so I'm just going to do that. So let's say let doc equals document. Now I'm going to have to do a little typecasting here, I think, because weirdly document and HTML document are different types, and I should just fix this. But instead we're just going to do this JS cast unchecked into WebSys HTML document. And do I even need to add that to cargo.toml somewhere? Yeah, so I just need to add that as a feature on WebSys HTML document. So let doc equals HTML document, let cookie equals doc.cookie. And then we're just going to return a really simple like cookie dot contains dark mode equals true, right? And that's initial, let's call this initial prefers dark. So if cookie contains dark mode equals true, right, which is how we're setting it, then it's true. And I'm returning, I should probably just return a bool here, right? But this obviously is only going to run on the client side, not the server side. So I'm actually going to mark this just with like a config macro not feature equals SSR. If you're not familiar with config macros like this is just a way of saying, look, I've got this SSR feature in my crate, and I've got a hydrate feature. SSR is for the server-side rendering, hydrate is for the client-side rendering. And what I want to do is basically, when it's not in server-side rendering, in other words, when it's running in the browser, so config not feature enabled is SSR. I'm going to do this stuff out of this cookie in the browser. And then we want to do the same thing when it is, right? Config feature equals SSR. We want to do something else. And this will access something in the server. And again, I'm just going to refer to my little example here so I can just see the right Actix stuff, and I'll just paste it out. But when we are in SSR mode, now we're actually going to pull in the request. So this is why I want to pass in the scope, right? Because we can, again, use context. Our Leptos Actix integration here, which is handling rendering the application, or which is handling that server function call, the Leptos Actix integration will provide an actual clone of the request object from Actix to all of our server functions and to the initial render of the page, which means we can use that context. We can just pull in this request. And I'm just basically unwrapping it here. And that has a cookies object on it. So we say, rec.cookies, and then prefers dark is obviously going to be, and we can actually just return this. It doesn't need to be a separate variable in this one. Cookies.map, and then, right, because cookies is a result, right? So if it's okay, then we have cookies, which is a deck of cookies. We can iterate over it, and we say, if there's any cookie where cookie.name is dark mode and cookie.value is true. So it's the same basic check as over here, right? And then we just unwrap or false, which means, if there are no cookies, we just return false. And of course, this will return if there are no cookies. If it finds the cookies object, but there are no cookies set, then it will also be false. So we default to light mode. We return dark mode if there's a dark mode equals true cookie. All right, so now where I've got prefers dark, set prefers dark, right? I can do this, what I call this function, initial prefers dark, and pass in my scope. And let's see, I may have some errors in here, I'm not sure. So let's see what we're dealing with. Oh, okay, so I guess I need to actually add CRD, which is probably actually an issue in our beta here, which I should fix. So let's see if I rebuild this again. Cool. All right, so I've clearly messed up the types a little bit on this cookie thing because I didn't have good support for it when I was writing it, because WebSys didn't have that feature enabled yet. So let's see if I just comment this guy out for now. Let's see if I have, come on, Rust Analyzer, you can do it. Okay, so we're actually just going to go into docs.rs, WebSys. I'm pretty sure HTML document, cookie. One of the annoying things about WebSys for me is that because it feature gates all that stuff, sometimes Rust Analyzer has not caught up yet. Great, so it returns result string. So that's super easy. I just need to unwrap or default, because if it's an empty string, it won't contain anything. So that's fine. Let's let this go. Cool. So this compiles, and I think we should expect it. Let me just try this one more time. I think we should expect this to be in light mode, right? Because, yeah, because there's nothing actually setting the cookie, right? And if we toggle dark mode, so we've toggled dark mode, right? We still have this color, this prefers dark is still controlling the color scheme, but it's not being stored anywhere. So now if we refresh, right, we're still in light mode. Okay, cool. So how do we actually set that, cookie? Well, the way that we set the cookie, right, is that we call this toggle dark mode server function. And so one actual way that we could do that would be that toggle dark mode is actually just like, you see this is an async function, right? So we need to do our little spawn local from WASM futures or just from leptos to run this. But yeah, I mean, why don't I just say, let's see, so currently prefers dark equals prefers dark.get. And then we want to toggle that, right? So let's say toggle dark mode. I don't know, CX, and not currently prefers dark. And then let's see, this is an async function, so it's going to do nothing. So instead, we actually need to spawn local, sync move, toggle dark mode. Gotta wait. Now, importantly, right, toggle dark mode. In order to run this on the server, we need to register this server function. And all that means is we're going to go over into this main.rs. And you remember this type here that was like toggle dark mode in camel case? So I'm going to pull that out, and we're going to do toggle dark mode register. And that is going to register that server function. Basically, it tells the server that it exists, so that when we call out to this URL that's for it, the server will know how to respond. So hopefully this will just compile, and we'll see what happens. Okay, so now whenever we click this button, right, it should hit the server. It should set this cookie. Now you'll notice nothing happened, right? But when I reload the page, we're in dark mode. And likewise, again, if I toggle this button again, nothing happens. But if I reload the page, we're in light mode. So, the reason for this is that, of course, now we are no longer setting preferred dark in here. So let's just do that one more time. Set prefers dark to be, let's just say, not currently prefers dark, just like we were doing. And now when we rebuild this, it should update too. Now this is pretty good. This is a pretty good solution, right? Because now we've got, hey, toggling dark mode, okay? And now when I do that force refresh again, there's no flash, right? No flash at all. Because when I pull it up here in the HTML, it's serving down, it already has meta name equals color scheme, content equals dark. Because in the cookie for the request to the server, in the request to the server, there is already that cookie set. And then we're reading it on the server, setting dark mode, and then reading it on the client, we know that we're in dark mode. So then it knows to start in dark mode so that when it toggles it again, now it's in light mode. And when we refresh, it's in light mode, and so on. So this is pretty good. This is pretty good. We can do a little bit better even. And to do that, I'm going to introduce something called an action or a server action and an action form. So a server action is basically just a way of automating this process, right? So we're going to say let toggle dark mode action equals create server action. We give it this type, the same type of that server function, which is toggle dark mode. Pass it in a little scope as always. All right, and now you see it's typed, it's an action, toggle dark mode with this result. So what can we do with this? Well, one thing that we can do with this is we can replace this with toggle dark mode action dot dispatch toggle dark mode prefers dark, not currently prefers dark. And so if you look at this, right, you'll see this dispatch on the action takes toggle dark mode, which is the type of this server function defined, right? And you see it has prefers dark as a field. So if you look at it, it's just creating a struct from the function arguments here, so that prefers dark is a Boolean in this toggle dark mode function has this toggle dark mode struct. And we've got prefers dark, not currently prefers dark. And then in this color scheme, we're going to change this so that rather than using this prefers dark up here, we're actually going to use, let's see, it should be toggle dark mode action dot value dot get. And this is an option. And so it should be like dot unwrapper default. So what this does, right, is it says, has this action sent a value, right? The value on this is the most recent return value of the async function this action calls. So an action is a kind of, it's called in, if you're familiar with like React query, tan stack query, that's a mutation. So it calls a function that does something asynchronously, but it's like a one-off action. It's not a resource that you're loading. This is a slightly clumsy way of doing this, right? But I think you can probably see how it works, right? So it's waiting. So the action has an input and a result. So dot value is the dot value returns the result. And I wonder if I need, and so if we, I just have the types wrong here, sorry. Yeah, good. So this should be like dot map value, value dot unwrapper default. I don't know why Rust Analyzer isn't helping me out here. Good. Right. So value returns a result that's either a Boolean or some server function error. And so we just want to do an unwrapper default, whatever. We don't care about handling the errors right now. And then now this is an option because it may not have given us anything. So if you're not quite following along with this, that's fine. This is kind of the intermediate step. I'm going to show you a slightly easier way of doing it here. But basically, what this is doing, right, is now instead of manually managing that signal, we're just dispatching to this action when we call this. And the action has a field for like the latest returned value from the action. And you'll notice when we do this server function, it returns whether you now prefer dark mode or not. So that's what you should be getting. Oh, and it's broken. There we go. So it's actually does the same thing, which is interesting. Now if I reload, wait, what's happening? So if I force reload it here, this is actually interesting. Let me go into my storage. Let me go into my cookies. Okay, so we now have, let me just delete this. So we're starting fresh. So this is empty, right? Toggling dark mode, there we go. Now it's in dark mode. But if I toggle dark mode again, it seems like it's not resetting it. And of course, that's right. Okay, good. Because this is doing this prefers dark thing, right? So we actually want to like refer, instead of prefers dark.get, we actually want to strip this thing out almost completely, right? Because we can just do this same thing as the previous value. But we're actually going to change this up a little bit first. So instead of using the returned value of it, let's say, well, actually, so let's just make this work first. So equals, I think that should work. So in other words, we're just fixing the toggling, and then we're going to do the better version because it was using this initial value that was set, but we don't actually quite want to do that. Okay, so now I toggle dark mode, right? Now it's properly toggling, and when I reload, it doesn't work, right? Because now we're not using this initial value anywhere. Okay, so because we are only using the returned value, not the input value and not the initial value, when we refresh the page, now it's actually broken again. All right, so here's what we're gonna do. We need to define like what is the actual current value, right? And I want to do one more thing before we get there, actually, because let's say that this dark mode thing is something else that we're doing on the server. Like let's say it is writing to a database. We need to update something in our user profile database. And let's say it takes a little while. So let's say that there's like actually a 1 second delay. I don't know if this is actually going to work as a way to do this. Sorry. But I want to show kind of what happens if there's a delay in this server function and we're waiting on that response from the server function, right? So let's refresh this. Okay, yeah, so you'll notice there's like a 1 second delay from the time I hit the button to the time it comes back. And that's actually great. Like what, in a sense, right? It's doing exactly what we're asking it to, because the action value is the most recently returned value, not the most recently sent value. So it's actually waiting to see for the server to respond and say, yeah, I set your thing and I'm sending you back the correct value. So this is really good, right? Because it lets you keep things in sync with the actual state of the server. Like it lets your database that you're accessing in that server function be the actual source of value, the ultimate source of truth rather. But it also means that there's a really slow response time if something takes a second. So instead of doing this value field, let's actually say let most recent equals, I have to pull this down a sec. So let's say like let the most recent value equals toggle dark mode action dot input. So this is a signal that gives us the most recent thing we've sent to that server action, right? And so that's going to be always the button that we just clicked. And we're actually going to put this in a variable. We're going to say let input equals this signal. And let's pull this out, right? We want to save this. We don't need this signal anymore because we're not updating it, but we want this initial value because otherwise we don't have it for the initial page load and then the toggling is off. So let's say like let initial equals initial prefers dark, right? And this is just a bool. It's synchronous, it's not reactive, it's just the boolean of the initial page load. And then we've got this input. So what if we do something like this? Let most recent, so we're creating a little derived signal here, right? So let most recent equals if input. So in other words, if you have sent something to the server function. So what we really want is like input.get.map. Oh no, see, this is all we need to do. Input.get is going to be none if we haven't sent anything, and it's going to be some value if we have. So all we need is input.get.unwrap or initial. See, figured it out eventually. Oh, and right, so this is actually why we needed the map, right? Because it returns, the input is this toggle dark mode struct. So we need .map args, and let's just call it args.prefers dark, right? So now it's going to be just a function that returns a bool for the most recent value. So now, right, currently prefers dark is this most recent call. So we can rip out all of that. Prefers dark is not most recent, right? When we dispatch this, that's a function, not a macro. And then color scheme can just be if most recent and this, the reason that we can move this closure into two different places, right? We move it into the toggle dark mode callback and we move it into the color scheme callback is because, of course, input is a signal, so it's copy, and initial is a Boolean, so it's copy. So this closure itself is actually copyable. So we move it into toggle dark mode, we move it into color scheme. Okay. How are we doing? Yeah. So if you see, what? Let's delete this. So if we toggle dark mode, why is it flashing back though? What's setting you? Oh, you know what? It's because, let's see, what's doing that? I genuinely don't know. So we click the button. Is it my 1 second delay here that's causing me a problem? I don't think it should be. Let's delete all this stuff. I toggle the button. It flashes on, it flashes back off. Let's put in some logs just for fun. It's the problem with live coding, right? Dispatching action. That's actually probably not going to really do anything, but let's see. Dos log, checking color scheme, checking most recent. Let me look at my network tab here. Okay, so when we click it, you'll see it makes a call here. Yeah, it's interesting. It's that 1 second when it's resolving. Whoa, what are you? When that call is resolving, it's resetting it. I'm actually not quite sure why that's happening. Whatever, that's okay. Let's see if we can just fix it and resolve it. All right, so this is great, except it still is entirely client side, right? It's using this button on click with the click handler. It's manually dispatching this thing. Let's do something else using this ActionForm component. So this ActionForm, right, is a form, and it basically takes the server function and it converts it into a form that you can use. So instead of manually dispatching the server function, it's going to dispatch that server function whenever we submit this form. And so you'll see it's actually really similar to what we've got up here. So instead of this button with toggle dark mode, we've got an input type equals submit. This could be button type equals submit, whatever. The value is using, I have some different variable names here as part of my problem. Let's get prefers dark here. So this prefers dark, right, is toggle dark mode action dot input dot get dot map, right, dot unwrap. So this is the same as this most recent that we had. So let's just pull that up. And then this color scheme is still, yeah, all good if we've named it prefers dark now. And likewise, we're actually going to toggle the text here. So this form, right, now when we submit the form, we'll dispatch the server function, and it actually takes the argument from the form arguments, right? So rather than this manual dispatching and building this struct out, we can actually just delete this toggle dark mode callback entirely because the form is going to manage it. And then the value, right, of this input, I'll pull this over so you can actually read it, right? We give a name to this form field that's prefers dark. And this is the same as the name of the argument to the server function. And the value of this is going to be toggled depending on that prefers dark field. So let's try building this and see what happens and whether we have the same. Let's see which errors we've got. Right, so we haven't actually imported what we need from leptos router. Fair enough. I'm now mixing two different versions of this, so some of my variable names are wrong. Unwrap, or this should be initial. And the name of the action is different. it's toggle dark mode action. And we're just building the server. Okay, and let me close this so that we can see. Okay, great. And so now we're panicking because we have not actually wrapped this in a router component, which is totally fine. So let's just do that. This is providing all of the context for router stuff that we need on the server and on the client. And I do want to say there's going to be a little bit of a payoff, hopefully, at the end of this. Okay. Yeah, so I don't know what was happening with that dispatch. It's possible that it was rerunning an effect or something that I was, accidentally tracking or whatever. But so point being, we've now got this perfectly fine working thing. When we reload the page, it's all good. And you can actually see it logging on this server too, where I put the login. Okay, so let me just walk through that again because it was probably a little confusing since I was pasting it in from somewhere. So here's our application, right? We've got this router, style sheet, title, whatever. We've got our dark mode toggle component. The dark mode toggle component takes this initial prefers dark, which we've looked at, which on the client side, it's just syncing up the state. On the client, it just reads document.cookie. On the server, it's pulling it out of the HTTP request headers, which we looked at. Then we've got this create server action for this toggle dark mode server function. We take this dark mode action and we feed it into a form. So the way that this action form component works, right, is anytime you submit the form, it turns the form fields into the arguments for the server function. It runs that function on the server, and then it returns to you. When it sends it, it puts those arguments into this input signal, which is this input signal we're using right here. And then when it gets the value back, it returns it, it puts it into a value signal. So you'll notice, right, the way that we're defining prefers dark is if you have done some form input, right? Like if you have submitted this form, then it's the last input. So it's this kind of optimistic UI, right? Before that 1 second long delay, it just is, what did you submit? It shows you what you actually want. If we wanted to build in some error handling, what we would do would be to see, check that against what the server sends back. Maybe you're logged in 2 different places. You've set the stuff in the database in 2 different places, whatever. We're not going that complex right now. And if you haven't, right, so this input, of course, is a signal that returns an option because you may not have actually submitted the form yet. You may just be on an initial load, right? In which case, if you haven't submitted this, it just unwraps or it gives you that initial value. And then we've got, the color scheme. I think we actually are we still even using this? Yes, we are. We're using it in the meta, right? So this prefers dark, we're accessing here. We're also accessing it in the actual value, right? So this is a reactive value for this hidden input field. So if you look in our button now, right? Our button is a form with a hidden field that says what the value is. So as we toggle it, the value updates here, right? So it knows what to submit on the next form submission. It just is toggling it back and forth. And the text of it is toggling too. By the way, just another little 0.1.0 note. You'll see this is in debug mode. We have these little comment markers for where the component boundaries are, which is just a debugging tool for you as you're working with this stuff. So you'll see we've got an action form, our dark mode toggle component, right? That has a fragment, which is all of its children. It's got an action form inside it, a form inside it, and then the form children right here are these 2 inputs. So you can see how it maps onto, dark mode toggle. This little unit type component, right, is our meta component here. You see the action form, which wraps a form component that we don't see. And then we project in these children, which are these 2 inputs right here, wrapped in this fragment. So this is just a debugging tool for you. Anyway, so now we're here, right? We've got this. So this is fine. This is the same thing we've been doing the entire time. You know, we force reload it. There's no flash, and you can actually see this is before it hydrates. As it hydrates, there's no difference. Button works, you know, whatever. But now we get to kind of the most important part. And this is where I want to talk just a little bit about the application design. I know it's been a long video, but this is pretty important. So particularly when you're building Rust and WebAssembly applications, one of the downsides you hear people talking about all the time is, you know, binary size for WebAssembly is larger than JavaScript, which means load times are longer. And you know, you can debate, it is very true, a kilobyte of WebAssembly is much faster than a kilobyte of JavaScript. You know, it gzips really well, all this stuff, right? But basically, load times are a little slower for like a Leptos app than for a solid app, for example. However, we have a client-server application. Like, I just want to appreciate for a second that this was less than 100 lines, right? You know, the app thing was the first 30 of them. We wrote this inline server function, and it just works, right? We can use it as if it's on the client. We saw that when we were spawning local and doing that manual dispatching. We can just call it, but it only runs on the server. We've got all this Actix native stuff right in here that we're accessing these real APIs. And so we've got this Rust backend integrated with a Rust frontend. We don't need this WebAssembly code at all to run if we structure our application correctly, right? Like the load time is a hit. You know, we take a hit on that. But this stuff is running on the server, right? This is a form element with a submit button and a field in it. So what happens, right, if we just turn off JavaScript? So you'll notice if we turn off JavaScript, that means we turn off WebAssembly, right? Because you can't load WASM without JavaScript. You'll notice this doesn't hydrate at all. These are the hydration markers, and these are the debug mode ones. They get shorter in the actual release mode. So we've turned off JavaScript, right? The WebAssembly doesn't work at all. Now you'll notice we have the 1 second slowdown here, right? Because it's actually doing a normal page refresh. But it works perfectly. And so if we take away our artificial delay here, we lose the optimistic UI, right, when we lose the WebAssembly. In other words, we lose the ability to update the screen, you know, before the server has actually reloaded the page. But let's say we take away that sort of artificial 1 second delay I just threw on there. So this is with no WebAssembly and no JavaScript. And you'll notice, right, the button doesn't work because this isn't a server function. We could make this a server function, right, if we wanted to. But the dark mode button works, which means immediately, right, on page load, you've got this, you know, accessible, progressively enhanced form that's doing this real function. And, you know, this just works, right? And then if we say, so let's actually put our delay back on so you can see what I'm talking about here. And let's make it a little shorter, right? From milliseconds, 250 milliseconds. So we've still got JavaScript disabled. And let's just wait for the server. Cool. So, okay, you know, a quarter of a second delay. It's working. It's fine. This is your Rust web application. You know, this feels like the kind of, you know, I wrote a PHP 6 app and it's on a $5 a month server or whatever. Fine. But now if I turn the JavaScript back on and reload the page, we have this instant update on the client side, even though you can see, let's see if I pull up the network tab here. It might be a little hard to see. Can I just delete all this? Delete, whatever. You can see it taking, like, if you look down here, that it takes that quarter of a second, but we're already updating the UI before it actually resolves. So this is kind of a best of both worlds thing, right? You're writing this application, you've got this dark mode toggle. This is now completely self-contained, right? So this whole chunk I could just throw into a little dark mode module if I wanted to. I don't have to worry about this in the app.rs. I mean, this is not going to compile for a few seconds because I need mod dark mode, and I need use dark mode toggle props, right? And of course, I need to put this bad boy actually up in the lib, and this I need to use, create dark mode toggle or whatever. But you understand what I'm talking about here, right? I can throw this into its own little module, and then I can access this. Oh, this is just not at all. Use leptos. But now, right, I've got my component here. It's a component. It's got whatever docs I want to add to it. It exists in its own little world. It manages its own little server function. None of that stuff needs to be in here. The meta tag doesn't need to be in the main part of my app. I needed to wrap it with the router to use the form component. Fair enough. This is going to be in the root of your application anyway. My dark mode thing exists over here. I can co-locate all this stuff, whether it's on the server side or the client side. I'm keeping it in a module that's a feature module, not 3 separate places, right? Where it's got some code running on the server, it's got some code running on the client, it's got a REST API in the middle. No, I'm just sticking this thing in a single 90-line module or whatever, and it manages the meta tag itself, right? It manages the form itself. It works with WebAssembly. It works without WebAssembly. The only thing I needed to do was just make sure I register this this function somewhere, and we're pretty much good to go. So I mean, that I think is the real power of using a framework like this, where you have that control over the full stack. This, to the best of my knowledge, is pretty unique among Rust web frameworks. That's not to say somebody else isn't doing this, but we really are designing it, for all that Leptos is the most performant WebAssembly DOM rendering machine, right? Like if you want to create a super performant client-side only, browser-only app, Leptos is a great option. But that's actually not where the cutting edge of web performance is right now. The cutting edge of web performance is in this, how do we create a really fast server rendering experience that's so tightly coupled to the UI in the browser that you experience a awesomeness page with this kind of graceful degradation, but you can write it just based on features, right? So we wrote this thing based on a dark mode feature we wanted to create. We've now got it in a dark mode module. But if we lose half of our application, like if WebAssembly doesn't load, this feature still works. And that is the way I think to write defensive Rust web applications for the future, right? Not to worry about that division into the client side and the server side so much as to write things in a way that runs if you don't have access to WebAssembly in the browser and enhances the experience if you do, which is, progressive enhancement and graceful degradation are two sides of the same coin, right? So anyway, this is kind of a long video. I hope that you saw some of the cool stuff we have in the 0.1.0, particularly with regard to some of these, little improvements for developer experience. You'll notice I don't have all of the you used to have to wrap a div here, wrap a div here. This is a little more polished release, right, than what we had before. Cargo-leptos is an amazing tool. These server functions are super powerful. And yeah, I mean, I hope that you all enjoy, and check out the code down in the repository in the video description, and I'll put a link to our Discord in there too, and a link to the repository, and enjoy. And the 0.1.0 beta should be out probably by the time you're seeing this video. Thanks everybody, have a great day.